human beings are fascinating. And we have been thinking hard about our world and our universe for a really, really long time. And so people in the past were sophisticated, engaged thinkers in the same way that we are, and they were confused and baffled and frightened in the same ways that we are. And we have so much in common with them, and I would love us to engage with history more in a lot of ways, whether that's mythic history, which I'm really talking about a lot right now, but certainly history in general, because those people were fascinating and we can learn so much about how to live our lives from them.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. Our podcast is a great way to discover the fascinating research that has earned U of I the Carnegie ranking of R1, a designation for research excellence that only 4% of all U.S. higher education institutions attain, and we're the only Idaho university to do so. I'm your host for the day. I'm Danae Lenz, the External Communications Coordinator at U of I, and I am joined, as always, by Lee. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Danae. I'm Lee Cooper, University of Idaho science writer and editor.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about mythology. And I have a question to kick us off. Do you have a favorite kind of myth? I'm thinking either like broad cultural or a specific type of myth, like a creation myth.
To answer this question properly, I would need like an hour, I think. But there's the obvious go-to. Love the Greek and Roman myths. It's, what I grew up with to a certain extent. And thanks to the Percy Jackson series for getting me back into them later in life. Those are delightful. But probably the one I kind of like the most is I really love the Native American myths. I used to teach at an environmental learning center, and we taught some of those. And it was so fun to tell stories that are from this location that our students didn't know about. And it kind of blew my mind that, while you're learning some of the Native American myths, you also learn things like, the fact that a lot of them had their own set of constellations. And for the most part, I only ever think about those in terms of, kind of the classic Greek and Roman ones. And for whatever reason, that blew my mind that other cultures had different constellations, most of them based on myths. And it probably shouldn't have been so surprising to me, but it was. And I just love that idea.
If I really sat down and thought about it, I probably could piece that together. But no, I've also never thought about the fact that different cultures have different constellations. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's like really simple concept. Why wouldn't all cultures pick out things in the stars? And yet, no, didn't think about it.
I was a huge Norse myth girly growing up. Several of my favorite book series were all about Norse myths. Love Thor to this day.
Who doesn't?
But I also have a fondness for Greek myths, in part because the origination of the name Danae comes from Greek mythology. So Danae was a princess of Argos, and her dad figured out that he was supposed to die by her son, so he locked her away in a tower. And then, of course, Zeus, saw her and was like, ooh, yeah, I'm into that. Let's go figure out a way to get in there. And he turns into rain.
As one does.
As one does. Seeps in through the ceiling and gets her pregnant. And then, of course, her dad finds out and he puts her and her son, Perseus, by the way, who went on to kill Medusa and is associated with Pegasus, puts them in a box and drops them in the sea, and then they're rescued by Poseidon. And that's where my name comes from.
Excellent. I didn't know that. That's awesome.
So yeah, I do love Greek myths as well. Today, though, we're going to talk to someone who's going to discuss a very broad range of myths and just get really into it and nerdy about it, and it's so much fun. Her name is Rochelle Smith, and she is the humanities librarian for the U of I library. In this episode, she discusses the surprising ways gods and goddesses and other beings across cultures are connected to crafting and making. And she also shares why these stories still matter and what they reveal about human creativity and imagination. Are you ready to get into it?
Lead on.
Hi, Rochelle. Welcome to the Vandal Theory.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you start us off just by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
Oh, sure. I'm Rochelle Smith. I'm the humanities librarian at the University of Idaho. Every college has a librarian. That's their liaison. It's the person who talks with their classes and buys materials for them. So I'm the person who does that for English, history, theater, modern languages, philosophy, and I'm also the library liaison to the College of Art and Architecture, so I'm their person as well. I talk to classes about research and how to do it. I help people one-on-one at the reference desk, or if they need help, they can make an appointment with me to talk with me if I'm within their subject area. And I buy books and other materials. I buy music scores, I buy DVD and Blu-ray sometimes. That's what we all do here, and those are the subject areas that I work with, and it's awesome.
I feel like we could do a whole episode just diving into your life as a librarian.
Absolutely. Librarians live fascinating lives.
We're actually going to spend most of this episode discussing mythology and a book that you're working on. Can you introduce us to the book? Tell us how that came about.
Yes, I've been working on a book for several years now that is about craft and mythology, and really about gods and goddesses and other supernatural beings in different cultures around the world, and why so many of them are crafters and makers. You'll notice that if you think about whether the Greek myths, so you think about Athena, who is a goddess of weaving as well as a goddess of war, or Hephaestus, who's a blacksmithing god. If you think about Egyptian mythology, there's Khnum, is a potter god who makes animals and human beings on a potter's wheel. There are spinners and weavers in Norse mythology. There are spinners and weavers and potters in a lot of different Indigenous American mythologies. And you just find that all over the world. So the way this came about was I actually had a reference question from someone who was working on a book. And she's the one who's pointed out, like, it's really weird. Like, all these gods and goddesses are makers, and why is that? That's weird. And I was like, man, that's a really good question. Why is that? And I started thinking about it. It's like, well, and then there's this, but then there's that, but then there's this example, but then there's that person. And at some point I just exhausted her, and she was like, look, I really just need like a 5-minute blurb. I don't really need to deep dive. And I was like, oh, too late. Can't hear you. Already deep diving. She really just wanted a short bit of information for the introduction to the book she was working on. But I was so captivated by that topic that I ended up imagining it as a bigger and bigger and bigger project until finally I was like, I think this might be a book and I think I might have to write it. Yikes. And so that's what I've been working on ever since. One of the things I've been working on ever since.
What do you think it says about humans that all of these different myths from all over the world have these gods that are also crafters?
One of the things that I noticed, and other people have noticed as well, is that you might think, well, gods and goddesses are kind of like human beings, right? We're the ones who imagine them, so it makes sense that they would do similar things to the things that we do. And that's, I think, certainly part of it. And I'm not just talking about gods and goddesses as in divine beings that people worship. It also applies to, fairies and elves and kami and all these other kinds of imaginings of the supernatural that people have all over the world. I say gods and goddesses and deities kind of as a shorthand, but there are plenty of other beings that we imagine and create and envision that also are makers. So I think that point that they're often a lot like human beings, fair enough, right? Like if you look at the Greek gods, for example, probably the body of mythology that most people in the West know best. I mean, the gods, they get married, they have fights with each other, they cheat on each other, they're vengeful, they're very, very human. They have a lot of human emotions, kind of outsized human emotions. The same is true for if you look at Norse mythology, for example, and you have Thor, who loves food and he loves to fight, and you got Loki, who's kind of tricky and always getting into trouble. And so there are these characteristics that they have that are a lot like us. Two things, though. One, of course, there are plenty of deities that aren't a lot like us. There are a lot of deities that are, for example, animal-headed, right? Like many Egyptian deities, for example, and Mesopotamian deities as well will have like the head of an ibis or the head of a crocodile or a hippopotamus. So there are these ways that they don't necessarily look like us. They don't necessarily engage like us. But one of the things that's interesting specifically about craft is that while many gods and goddesses are makers, a lot of times they are not doing other kinds of human work. Right. So they are seldom cooking. For example, if you think about the Greek gods, they live on nectar and ambrosia. Those are the food and drink of the gods. You never see them like cooking a steak. You never see them, pressing grapes and making wine. Like they just don't do those things. Well, that's not true. Dionysus, of course, is a wine god and drinks a lot of wine, but you still don't see him really making wine. He just sort of is a guy who governs wine. And you don't see them tilling the soil and growing crops, for example, even if they're gods and goddesses who eat. Like the deities in Asgard are always feasting in the Norse pantheon, but you don't really see them like growing wheat to make beer or raising bees to make honey to make mead. And yet they are persistently makers, right? Certainly in the Norse pantheon, the dwarves are renowned smiths, renowned jewelers, and they make these amazing things. And those things play a big role in their stories in a way that other kinds of work tend not to. And so that in and of itself is really sort of fascinating. One of the things I did was spend a lot of time just gathering kinds of stories. Because again, I knew the Greek and Roman pantheon and the Norse pantheon the best myself, because those are the myths I got acquainted with as a kid and fell in love with mythology, and I've loved mythology ever since. So those are the ones I think about the most. But so I was looking for in other places to be like, maybe that's just kind of a fairly localized idea. I mean, both Greece and Norway are part of Europe, so it makes sense that they would sort of think about things maybe in a similar way, even across time and across quite a bit of distance. But again, there are Japanese makers, there are Chinese makers, there are Egyptian makers, makers from all over Africa, South America, North America, Australia, Oceania. So it's such a common phenomenon. And you're right, that does lead to the question of, well, why might this be? What is it about us? And that's a hard question to answer because the human imagination is such a funky thing and people theorize about it all the time. One of the things that I notice that happens in a lot of myths is that one of the things that myths are often about is the way that human beings are different from other animals. That's a common theme. People don't draw the lines in the same place all the time in different cultures. And the lines change. I mean, when you think about Western culture and you think about science and the way that people say like, well, man is the only animal that uses tools. And then and then the chimpanzees are like, what up? And people are like, oh, right. They use tools too. So do whales. So do butterflies. Well, human beings are the only animals who play. And then like every other mammal is like, are you kidding? And so on. And so even within science, which tries to set these hard boundaries, those ideas are always changing, or the only animals who grieve and so on and so forth. And yet we are always interested because we are such cognitive beings. We're always thinking about things about, well, what makes us like or not like other animals. And so there are lots of myths in which us being kind of not like other animals is part of the point of the myth. Famously, the Greek myth of Prometheus and human beings getting fire is about that and deals with that. In some versions of the myth, it's not every version of the myth because there's several versions of it, but there's certainly a version where Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus are in charge of kind of creating creatures to live on the earth. And Prometheus decides he's going to make people. I think at the time he's going to make men. There aren't any women yet because that's Pandora that comes along later. And Epimetheus is going to make the other animals. And of course, Prometheus's name means forethought, so Prometheus, and Epimetheus's name is sort of afterthought. So Epimetheus is not someone who's going to plan ahead really well. So basically, they're left with the raw materials to make creatures and a whole bunch of attributes they can give them. And Prometheus has to go run some errands and is like, okay, when I get back, I'm going to make people. And Prometheus is like, great, while you're doing that, I'm going to make animals. And Prometheus leaves, and Epimetheus is like, woohoo, okay, let's make some animals, and just starts throwing attributes around. And so, gives eagles like amazing eyesight and talons and wings and speed, and gives leopard and camouflage and again, amazing eyesight and hearing and, and claws and teeth and all these things, and just hands them out, like just makes it rain. So all these animals have all this, like they can breathe underwater, amazing night vision, amazing hearing, and so on and so forth. So when Prometheus comes back and it's time for him to make people, there's like nothing left. There's nothing left. Like he just has like clay. He makes these people and they're just these sad little like clay, shivering, naked, hairless. I mean, they're toast. Like anything that comes, like winter comes, they're all gone. Any animal walks by and feels like eating them, they're gone. Like they're just hot dogs. Prometheus is like, this is terrible. Like I love these creatures that I've made. I have to do something for them. And that's part of what prompts him to give human beings fire. The story has lots of parts and there's lots more to it. But basically, as most people will know, he steals fire from Mount Olympus to give to human beings, and of course is punished for that by being chained to Mount Caucasus and having a vulture eat his liver every single day until Heracles frees him years later, centuries probably later. Encapsulated in that story is the idea, one, of how physically different we are from so many other animals, from the animals that we would have admired since we first developed consciousness, right? If you are a prehistoric person, a lot of your life is observing animals, whether because you're hunting them or whether just because, you're with a small group of human beings, that other animals are just a big part of your visual and auditory world. And so you're looking at how amazing it is that birds can fly, how well designed fish are for swimming, how amazing a walrus is, and so on and so forth. And then there's us, and like, wow, that's not like, without clothes, we're going to freeze to death tomorrow. Without tools, our hands are, I cannot dig a hole with just my bare hands. Like, I can't dig up roots with just my bare hands. My nails will break, my fingers will bleed. That'll be the end of me. Our being able to make tools, use tools, make things is a big part of what allows us to just not have died out thousands of years ago. And certainly in a lot of ways, what has allowed us to dominate the earth in the way that we do. So I think that's a really interesting thing that human beings have obviously been observing for a really long time. There's, I believe, a Blackfoot story in which the creator is making the earth, and Old Man Coyote, who is friends with the creator, is walking along with him. At one point, he makes animals, and he makes people, and Coyote says, you have to give them fire. Like, they're gonna die if they don't have fire. And the creator's like, yeah, it's a good point. So I'll give them fire. And he's like, you have to help them out. You have to give them weapons so they can hunt. And the creator's like, yeah, that's a good idea too, Coyote, you're right. And so gives people weapons. But he's about to give weapons to everybody. And Coyote says, you can't give weapons to anybody else. And creator's like, why? And Coyote's like, because look at them. Like, they're going to get massacred if you give, like, wolves bows and arrows. Are you kidding? That's it for them. This is such a common theme in so many stories where you get that sense of how much we depend on the skill of our hands, being able to think through a problem and make something for a situation is absolutely what allows us to not die. Again, other animals also make things. In fact, it's probably likely that we learn to make some things from looking at other animals and their behavior. But in a lot of ways, so much of the skills that other animals have and the gifts that they have are inborn and inherent in them in a way that they don't seem to be in us. And I think that observation is a big part of what animates a lot of these stories. So why we need, in a sense, we need divine teachers. We need both someone to show us how to do these things, because it's amazing that we can do it. It's amazing that we can make a boat. Like, that's nuts. Like, why would we know how to do that? It seems very natural to think we must have had divine help with that. And so therefore, these gods who want to help us, they want, because they want us to worship them. They want us to interact with them. They need us, according to certainly some ways of thinking about mythology. The gods die if they don't have us. They die if they're not worshipped. And so they need us. And so they need us to not all die, because then they'll all die. So they show us how to make things and guide us in that making and teach us about it so that we can have culture, so that we can exist. And so we can also do things like build temples, do things like make sacrificial fires, do things that honor them. And that seems to be a big part of why specifically they're makers. But that's just my theory. I'm still exploring and still thinking about it.
Okay, so you've obviously read a lot of myths. In addition to the crafting thing, what are some other interesting ideas that you've come across? Either something really unique or something that's more broad that can be found all over.
Wow, that's such a good question. I mean, again, obviously, I'm kind of a myth dork. It's very hard to tell me a myth I won't enjoy. I'm really interested in creation myths in general. In some ways connected to the whole idea of crafting, because there are so many ways that the universe gets made in myth. Some of them are very much about making things. There's a Chinese story of a deity called Panku who literally chisels the world. He's born with a chisel in one hand and a hammer, and he basically hammers out the world. There are stories where the sky is woven by a deity, where the earth is woven, where certainly lots of stories where the earth is made out of clay and the sky is made out of clay. But there are also stories where the universe hatches out of an egg, stories where a deity speaks the universe into existence, which obviously shows up in the book of Genesis, for example, where God says, let there be light, and there's light. Stories where deities sing the universe into existence, which is very true in a lot of the stories in Australian dreaming for First Nations Australian people. And stories where a deity is killed and their body is used to make the earth and the sky, which is true in Norse mythology, where the giant Ymir is killed by his sons, and then they use his head as the vault of the sky and his body becomes the earth, and so on. That's a very, very common style of myth. And so again, just watching human beings extrapolate from things we know to things we have no way of really knowing, but we want to attempt to engage with is always really interesting. So that's really fascinating to me. I love etiological myths, like kind of why things are the way they are. There are actually a lot of stories about stealing fire, because right, we talked a little bit about fire. Why in the course of stealing fire, crow or raven becomes black, why coyote gets a black tail, why an animal has a black streak down its back, and it's because of trying to get fire. So I really love those stories because they're pure flights of fancy in so many ways. People just love to think, okay, this animal, like this skunk has a stripe. Why would that be? What's a really fun way to talk about that? Like that to me is really, really interesting. It's interesting to me too to think about when people want to encode something so people remember it generations on. Like this volcano explodes sometimes, just so you know, how that becomes part of myth, because myths are such a wonderful way to keep information going, especially when you're in a culture that doesn't have writing, that keeps its information going orally, that you want to tell the most exciting, interesting story possible so that your great, 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 great grand descendants will still remember that and know that, like, okay, when the mountain starts rumbling, it's time to go. I love it. There aren't that many kinds of myths I don't like, so that's the hard question to answer.
Okay, so I'm not going to make you pick a favorite myth or pick a favorite body of mythology, but I would like to know what works of mythology are out there from cultures that we don't hear about too often that you would love for more people to look into and know about.
I've become really interested in Central Asian mythology, in the mythology of Mongolia, Tibet, the Asian steppes in general, and the people who have lived in those places for thousands of years, because I think that's a body of myth we really don't know a whole lot about. A lot of times when you go looking for Mongolian myth, for example, you'll find either anthropological accounts or these very, very, very brief bits. And there are some amazing mythological cycles in Mongolia and in that part of the world, in Siberia and again in Tibet and so on, that tell these amazing tales of heroism and demon fighting and all these amazing things. And I got into that as I was researching the book, and I don't pretend to know a whole ton about it, but I'm really fascinated. Like, I'm fascinated by the Epic of Geysir, for example, which is a myth cycle involving Geysir, who is a king and is a demon slayer. He's a demon fighter. It's one of the major things he does. And he's not a lot like, I was going to say he's a lot like King Arthur, but that's not really fair. King Arthur and he have some things in common. For example, they didn't really die, according to the stories. They just have gone away, and at a time when their country really needs them or their people really need them, they're going to return. Still very much part of the story of Arthur in Britain and absolutely a part of the story of Geysir throughout Central Asia. I really love that body of myth, and I wish that in general there were just more books available about those myths in English and in other Western languages. I also would love for more people to know more about Australian and Tasmanian mythology. I mentioned the dreaming earlier, and because I think that is such a way of thinking about the world, the creation of the world, and human beings' place in the world that has so much in common with Indigenous thought around the world, and at the same time is so distinct and unique. The people in Australia and Tasmania have been, well, up until European contact, had been on their own for a really long time on these bodies of land and had time to develop this really fascinating, very, very in-depth relationship with particular features of the land and particular bodies of water. And in the way that they talk about those and tell stories, they're really fascinating. And I just think that anyone who's interested in Indigenous thought, and certainly there's more conversations about Indigenous thought in the US and Canada, for example, now. And I think looking at Indigenous thought around the world is really fascinating. And I think Australia and Tasmania are a really great place to begin.
That's awesome. You definitely sold me.
Oh, right on. Okay, cool. Well, I hopefully will have recommendations for you, because we do have books about it in the library. Come to the library. We do have stuff. A lot of those books are in my office right now, but I'll let them go if I need to.
Okay, well, we're almost done here, but what do you want people to most take away from this conversation?
One, just that human beings are fascinating, and we have been thinking hard about our world and our universe for a really, really long time. And so people in the past were sophisticated, engaged thinkers in the same way that we are, and they were confused and baffled and frightened in the same ways that we are. And we have so much in common with them, and I would love us to engage with history more in a lot of ways, whether that's mythic history, which I'm really talking about a lot right now, but certainly history in general, because those people were fascinating and we can learn so much about how to live our lives from them. One of the things about being a librarian is we tend to be generalists, right? You become a librarian partly because you like helping people find things out, but partly because you kind of find everything interesting. I'm an incredibly hard person to bore. I just find most things fascinating. And one of the things that I think is really great in terms of talking with students on campus is the fact that I am a generalist. So, for example, if you're a student and you're taking a history class, your history professor might be a national authority on medieval Britain. And that's wonderful. They can also be a little bit intimidating to be like, I'm going to go to this person who's a national authority on medieval Britain and ask them like a question about like, I don't know, medieval latrines. I can't do that. Like, but librarians are people who I'm like, I don't know anything about medieval latrines, but let's find out. Okay, let's go. And I really love to help people have ownership over their own curiosity and to feel like whatever you're interested in, you can think about that like a scholar. You can think about that in a deep way. You can think about that in an engaged way. We can take that to whatever place you want to go with it. There are plenty of things that I like learning a little bit about, but there's some things where I'm like, I really want to know more about that. And then I go find out more about it. And I would love it if students felt like that was allowed for them as well, which it of course absolutely is. But I think sometimes students think I have to write about a deep, important topic. Like I have to write about, I don't know, nuclear arms control, or I have to write about the death penalty, or I have to, because that's what a serious student does. And I'm like, if you want to write about samurai, or you want to write about peanut butter, or you want to write about Norse myths, come talk to me. We will make that an interesting, amazing thing that you can then write a great paper about, or that you can write some fan fiction about, or that you can just enjoy thinking about. And I think that that's one of the best things about being alive and having a brain, is being able to think about all the things. And I love that. And this book for me feels like an example of that, because I am not an expert in this area. I'm not a mythologist. I'm not a classical studies person. I don't read ancient languages. I'm just somebody who's really interested in this topic and didn't see anybody else talking about this particular aspect of it. And I thought, maybe I have something I can contribute, and I have something to say that other people might find interesting. And I think we all have something to say other people will find interesting. So come over to the library and we'll figure it out together.
I love that. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It's really been fun getting to know you and talking with you.
So, what did you think of the interview?
I think it's really interesting to think about the uses of these mythological stories and the fact that, I mean, it seems like these gods, as she was talking about them as makers, were for sort of two different reasons, maybe, in the fact that, one, it's because we suck as in terms of compared to animals. No claws, no night vision, none of the cool stuff. So the gods get, almost showing that they want us to live. They want us to survive. Somebody's in your corner. So it's almost like a character that is rooting for you, a coach type character. While the other one is, you've been given these aspects so that you can worship them, which is sort of a different character. But then, I'm having that conversation in my head while also thinking about, but when these myths were made, they weren't myths, they weren't stories, they were how somebody saw reality. And then that's so interesting from how does a culture create all these myths together? And I mean, wow, you just start rabbit holing on this, and being a librarian sounds delightful.
Something she said at the end there kind of ties into a theme that has come up on this podcast a couple times, which is one of the wonderful things about living in today's day and age with things that are digitized and experts everywhere. People who have no expertise in anything, their brain gets a niggling that something might be interesting, and they just can go pull on that thread. And also just go talk to your librarians. Like, they have such a broad spectrum of knowledge and can just point you in the right direction. And I love that.
Yeah, the accessibility of knowledge today is just, it's mind-blowing.
Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our website at uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory to learn more about our research and listen to all of our episodes. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu. We're on all of the podcasting platforms, so please rate and review and subscribe. I'm Danae Lenz.
And I'm Lee Cooper.
Thanks for joining us.